The brothers to kindly gather towards the mimbar. Our guest speaker today shall be Mufti Ismail Akubat Sahib, Imam of Masjid Quwwatul Islam. All brothers are kindly requested to gather and complete their tilawat.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فقد قال سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لن تنالوا البر حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون وما تنفقوا من شيء فإن الله به عليم صدق الله العظيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذرياته. My dear respected friends, in these few moments, inshallah, we just want to reflect upon one of the lessons which we are taught whilst we are fasting in the month of Ramadan. One of the reflections and one of the highlights of fasting. And that is that the amal of fasting is one of the most private and intimate acts of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fasting is a very, very secret amal. With regards to other a'mal, many of us right now are just engaged in the tilawah of the glorious Quran. The tilawah of the glorious Quran is an amal in which you do and other people see, you also see. When you offer salah, it is an amal which you are doing. You see that amal, other individuals also see that amal of yours. Spending in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is an amal which you see and with which others can also see. However, fasting is a ibadah of abstinence, meaning that you're not practically doing something whilst you are fasting. Everyone sitting here, everyone is engaged in this ibadah of fasting. However, we cannot see. I cannot see if you are fasting. You cannot see if I am fasting. Why? Because fasting is a hidden action. You're staying away from something and no one can see what you're staying away from. So it's a very intimate ibadah between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hence, the ulama mention that one of the most sincere acts of ibadah is indeed fasting. Some ulama have gone to that extent that a sawm laysa fihi riya. There's no possibility of there being any riya, any ostentation and any showing off in fasting, because like I said, no one knows between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you are fasting, especially outside of Ramadan. If you're keeping a nafil fast, no one will realize. It is said with regards to a pious individual, Allama ibn Rajab rahimahullah, he states that صام بعض السلف 40 سنة لا يعلم به أحد. That an individual from the Salafus Salihin, he fasted for 40 years, meaning nafil fasts. He kept fasting nafil fasts for 40 years of his life, لا يعلم به أحد, not one individual found out. Not even his family members. When we're fasting, at least our family, no one in the masjid will find out, but at least our family members will know. Our partners, our children, our parents, those who live with us, they will at least find out when you're doing sahri and when you're doing iftar. However, he fasted in such a way that for 40 years, not even his wife found out about his fasting. How? He would leave his house and go to work, and he would take his lunch with him. So he would take a packed lunch with him. And on the way to the marketplace, he would give his packed lunch in sadaqah to the poor people, and then he would go to work. So the people at work, they would think that he's eaten at home. And when he'd return home, his family members would think that he's eaten his lunch at work. So likewise, for 40 years, he kept this secret between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And something else also I remember is Allama ibn Rajab has mentioned about someone else, how they loved their private relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how they tried to hide their a'mal for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he had a particular amal hidden and reserved only between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for so many years. And it so happened that some individual, he found out about the secret amal of his between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, when someone else saw him doing this amal, what did he say? He said, إِنَّمَا كَانَتْ تَطِيبُ الْحَيَاةُ مهما كانت العمل بيني وبين الله سبحانه وتعالى. That I only enjoyed living in this world, and life was only pleasurable to me when this amal and this secret was between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And as soon as someone else found out, he actually went and asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he didn't want to live no longer in this world because this secret between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had been disclosed. My dear respected friends, the question is, fasting teaches us, as-sawmu li. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, kullu amal ibni adama lahu illa as-sawm. Every action of the son of Adam is for him, except for fasting. فَإِنَّهُ لِي. This is for me. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ. Because this is the pinnacle of sincerity, and this amal is only done for my sake, I will guarantee the reward of fasting in the hereafter. So the question, my dear respected friends, is that have we learned this lesson from fasting? And do we have anything in our life which we can give for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which we can leave for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cherish? Do we have that amal in our life? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, and I'm just going to give a few examples of how we can do something for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will really appreciate. The ayah I recited, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. That you can never reach the pinnacle of piety until you spend in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mimma tuhibbun, from those things which are very beloved to you. Why can you not reach the pinnacle of piety until you spend that which is very beloved to you? Because giving anything in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spending anything for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is of no value to you, is very easy. But spending something which is dear to you is indeed a sign that you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَيَمَّمُوا الْخَبِيثَ مِنْهُ تُنْفِقُونَ وَلَسْتُمْ بِآخِذِيهِ إِلَّا أَن تُغْمِضُوا فِيهِ. Don't intend to give something in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلَسْتُمْ بِآخِذِيهِ, something you yourself would not accept. إِلَّا أَن تُغْمِضُوا فِيهِ, except for you were to close your eyes and you were to accept that thing very unwillingly, only then you would accept that thing. Don't give that in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Give something that you value and give something that you love, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can reward you for it. A very common example which we see in every masjid is that just look at the attars which are placed on the sides of the masjid. You know, you're rarely going to find a nice smelling attar. Why? All those attars which you like, you're going to keep them in your wardrobe, and that strong one which some chacha gave you and you cannot put on, you're going to come and put that inside the masjid. Okay, it happens everywhere. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. You're not going to reach the pinnacle of piety until you spend from that which you love. The ulama will tell you that over here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not want everything which you love. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has used the word min, lit-tab'id, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants some of that thing which you love. We don't need to spend everything which we love in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just something or a percentage of something which is dear to you. Spend that in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will really appreciate that sacrifice of yours. And on this ayah, the ulama mentioned, you know, there's a very delicate science of tafsir which is called the connection between the ayat, which is called the rabt and the munasabah between the ayat. So the ulama have gone into this ayah as well, and they've mentioned a very amazing link between the previous ayah, which is the final ayah of the third juz, and the opening ayah of the fourth juz, and in it there is a great lesson for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions at the end of the third juz, the last ayah is that إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَمَاتُوا وَهُمْ كُفَّارٌ فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمْ مِلْءُ الْأَرْضِ ذَهَبًا وَلَوْ افْتَدَى بِهِ. That on the day of Qiyamah, in the hereafter, even if the non-believers, they want to give the entire earth full of gold to save themselves from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا تُقُبِّلَ مِنْهُمْ. This will not be accepted. The entire space between the earth and the heavens is filled with gold. مِلْءُ الْأَرْضِ ذَهَبًا. If he was to give this in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah ta'ala will not accept this, it's too late. And in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that اتَّقُوا النَّارَ وَلَوْ بِشِقِّ تَمْرَةٍ. Even half a date stone can extinguish the fire of Jahannam. So when we have the time, half a date can extinguish the fire of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the fire of Jahannam. But if we've left it too late, and that wealth which we loved, we didn't give at the right time, then at the wrong time, if we fill the entire world with gold, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not accept. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from the lives of the Sahaba, how they were ready to give what they cherished for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what they loved for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how they did things just for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first incident is with regards to Abu Talha radiyallahu anhu, and cutting the long story short, he had an orchard which was right opposite the masjid, and this was very dear to him. The name of this orchard is Bayruha. So he came to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam when this verse was revealed, and he said to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants something which we love. So وَإِنَّ أَحَبَّ أَمْوَالِي إِلَيَّ بَيْرُحَا. My most precious item is this orchard of mine. And he said, وَإِنَّهَا صَدَقَةٌ لِلَّهِ. I am donating this entire orchard. Remember, it wasn't necessary to give everything you love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they went above and beyond. He said, this entire orchard of mine is sadaqatun lillahi wa li rasuli, is in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Arju birraha wa dhukhraha indallahi ta'ala. I am hoping for the reward of this in full measure by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu anhu, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, again a very selfless individual who was always ready to give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nafi', his student, mentions that وَكَانَ ابْنُ عُمَرَ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ إِذَا اشْتَدَّ عَجَبُهُ لِشَيْءٍ مِّن مَالِهِ تَقَرَّبَهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. That Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, whenever he would find something of his, one of his assets, one of his belongings, something belonging to him he would like, immediately he would give that in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's actually incidents mentioned, amazing incidents mentioned about how Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, anything which touched his heart, It was for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nafi' mentions once we were on our journey to Hajj, and Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu was traveling on his camel, on his conveyance. And this camel, the way it was walking, the way it was providing transport to Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, أعجبه masiruhu. The riding of this camel amazed and pleased Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. He found it amazing, he found it nice. Immediately, when he realized that I like this camel, and this is something which now my nafs is liking, immediately he stopped in his journey, he stopped in his tracks, anakha al-ba'ir, he made the camel sit down, and immediately he said to Nafi' adkhiluhu fil budn, this camel, its riding and its walking and its transportation has pleased me. You go and take this camel and immediately place it with the camels of sadaqah. Give it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now let's think for a second, those of us who have our lavish and our posh cars. When we're driving our cars and we rev the engine and we like the sound of the engine, dare this thought ever enter our hearts that we need to give this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Immediately Abdullah ibn Umar, when he liked this conveyance, immediately he gives it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A second incident of Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. Whenever he saw any of his slaves and he saw deendari inside these slaves, when he saw anything of their piety, their salah, their taqwa, as a prize of this piety, he would free them for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now the slaves, they realize that if we show our piety to Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, we show a bit of deendari to Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he's going to free us. So now, amongst them, what they did, that every time Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu was present, and they saw Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu walking, they would immediately stop their salah. And if they realize Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu is inside the masjid, they'd stay in the masjid for ages and engage in nafal salah just to deceive Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. So then he'd see that mashallah, he's very deendar, he's always inside the masjid. So Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu would free him for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he'd say that if a servant or a slave of mine, he is deendar and he's pious, then he shouldn't be in my service, he shouldn't be in the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So someone said to Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, and he said that you do know right that they are deceiving you. Innahum yakhda'unak. They're deceiving you. They're not really that pious, but when they've realized this habit of yours, they put on this show just so that you free them for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the response Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu gave is so amazing, and he says that man khada'ana billahi in khada'na lahu. He said that whoever gives me deception and whoever deceives me for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and let's paraphrase this, he says that whoever deceives me by doing the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in khada'na lahu, I am ready to be deceived by this individual. Meaning I will free him for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one more incident I'll share with you inshallah, is that Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu was on his deathbed. He was on his deathbed. And a dying person, sometimes he has these random cravings. So Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he craved for some grapes. On his deathbed, whilst he was passing away, he craved for some grapes. Now his son, Salim ibn Abdullah, he went and purchased some grapes from the marketplace for his father, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, and he presented it to Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, from the bunch of grapes, he took out one seed. He took out one grape. And he was about to put this in his mouth, and then a sa'il, a beggar, came on the door. And this beggar, he asked for some food. And this was the only food present in the house at the time, this bunch of grapes which Salim brought for his dying father. Immediately upon hearing this knock, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu said that give this bunch of grapes to the beggar. So then Salim, his son, said that, you're in the last stages of death, you've had a craving for these grapes, you eat these grapes, I'll go get something for this beggar. So then Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, coming back to this verse, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu said, no, give this exact bunch of grapes, because I heard my beloved Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam said, خَيْرُ الصَّدَقَةِ مَا كَانَ عَنْ شَهْوَتِهَا. The best sadaqah is giving the sadaqah of something which you're craving. And because I'm craving these grapes in the last stages of my life, go and give this to the beggar. So Salim ibn Abdullah, he gave this, he went and took this bunch of grapes to the beggar. And then immediately when the beggar left, he ran behind the beggar and he explained the situation that my father is in the last stages of death and he's really craving these grapes. Give me this for now, I'll get something for you. So this beggar immediately, he gave this back. Now he brought this back to Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, and after some time passed, maybe he regained consciousness, and he offered him these grapes, that I've bought some more grapes for you. Again, another beggar comes and the same thing happens. The third time round, when this incident occurs again, exact same thing happens again. Another beggar comes and Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he is telling his children to give this in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because he is desirous of this. And the third time, when he gives this in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the riwayah mentions that Abdullah ibn Umar, after doing this sadaqah and whilst craving these grapes, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he passes away. He passed away craving grapes, but he did not dare eat from these grapes when there was a beggar asking, just to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So my dear respected friends, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that we are fasting. And this fasting is an exercise of doing something only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and doing something in hope only from reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a secret act of amal which no one else can see. We need to do mashq, we need to practice upon this intention, and then even after the month of Ramadan, try to do something solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can also say, like Abu Talha radiallahu anhu said, that arju birraha wa dhukhraha indallahi ta'ala, that this is something I've done and I'm only hoping for the reward of this when I meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the true understanding. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Brothers are now requested to engage in dua.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم لك صمت وبك آمنت وعليك توكلت وعلى رزقك أفطرت. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا